To introduce our esteemed keynote speakers, I'd like to welcome Maria Church, editor of Avert magazine, to take the stage.
Thanks, Brittany. We are fortunate to have with us today two senior leaders when it comes to interoperability in Canada. Lance Valcourt is an independent consultant, strategic advisor, and author. He retired from the Ottawa Police Service after 33 years of service in 2010. And between 2008 and 2014, he spearheaded the creation of and then led the Canadian Interoperability Technology Interest Group, or CTIG, which we'll be hearing about quite a bit in the next half hour. Also happens to be Lance's birthday today, so I think that speaks to his dedication to interoperability in Canada that he's here with us. Pascal Rodier is the Provincial Director of Emergency Preparedness for Nova Scotia Health. And before that, he spent 30 years in progressive leadership roles in emergency medical services and was a founding leader of CTIG as well. So I'm excited they're both here with us today to talk about Canada's interoperability strategy and action plan, share their vision for interoperability, national interoperability, and discuss where we go from here. So Lance, Pascal, welcome. We're happy to have you with us. I'll also note that Lance and Pascal will be speaking for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to questions. So pop those into the Q&A tab at any time. I'll be monitoring those and pose those questions to them in that question period. Over to you both.
Thanks very much.
Perfect. No, thanks very much. And Lance, I promised I wouldn't say anything about your birthday. I didn't say anything about Maria not saying anything about your birthday.
Thanks, buddy.
Bon après-midi tout le monde. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon from across Canada and internationally. If you're joining us, great to have this conversation. Excited to not only be back sharing about interoperability, which has been a big part of my life for at least, almost over 20 years now, and to be sharing the stage, not just with Lance, but with some real champions, different organizations, agencies, parts of academia that are going to be sharing today some of their experiences and knowledge. And it's really important to me personally to make this better for our responders and for those in the field to be able to serve better and to be safer. So for me, this is a great topic. I thank the three magazines for coming together and putting this together, and really a great opportunity for us to start to share. So really today we're going to start off with a little bit of history, a little bit of where we came from, where we are, and where we're hoping to go with this. And we'll be going back and forth with Lance. In Canada, we know that interoperability means at least this. We've agreed, I think, collectively, nationwide, that we want to be able to share the right information to the right people at the right time as authorized. And that's a key piece to that. We have a lot of concerns, especially nowadays, with what information is being shared. So we want to make sure that we're getting that right information, but we're doing it at the right time. We don't want to, we'll get into some of that in the presentation, but we don't want to cross over some of those legal barriers or some of those privacy areas or some of that stuff that's secretive, especially for our law enforcement partners. For me, and people that have heard me talk about interoperability, this is really what it's about. I always have to talk about this slide anytime I do this presentation. And this was a slide that we did for our interoperability project in BC. It took months to coordinate, trying to get 3 levels of government together just to take a photo with a bunch of cool vehicles. We did this at Coast Guard Sea Island Base in Richmond, BC. It should have beautiful mountains in the background, but of course it was cloudy. Took a bunch of photos. We have a bunch of these photos, really cool stuff with the hovercrafts. And then it dawned on me till after everybody had left, we didn't take any pictures with the responders. We just took it with the agencies. And that's not what interoperability is about. Interoperability is about the people. And you're going to hear that as a common theme, I think, as we go through today, but it's about the people. And I've actually kept this photo as a reminder to myself that I should have been better at getting people into the photo, because that's really what it was about. It was about getting those Coast Guard members, firefighters, police officers, and paramedics that were there that day to stand there and to be recognized. One of the biggest pieces for me is it's not about the technology. And I think we can all agree on that. It's how do we move this interoperability piece forward? Yes, we need that voice capability. Yes, we need to get to a better place where we're using broadband and sharing data. But we really need to change the culture. We need those champions. We need those people, those leaders, as we're hearing today. Many leaders are going to be joining us today. We need those leaders in those positions to be able to walk away from today and start to make that change. Let's get back to what we are and working together with this. So there has to be that willingness, and we see that as really one of the biggest hurdles throughout at least the last few years that I've been involved. We don't need to talk about why we need it. Every post-after action report that was ever been done identifies failure of interoperability, failure of communication. as one of the top ones. You know, as dramatic as 9/11 was, we'd already had after action reports from the previous bombing at the World Trade Center in the parkade, and interoperability was a failure, and it continued to be after 9/11. So, you know, we've seen this. I don't think anybody on here needs to be advised why we need it, but we need to do better, because we're still not there. Canada's not immune. We have a lot of our natural events that impact our communities and our disastrous impacts that way. But we started to see parts of the country where this was really coming together. And in 94, we always say, I mean, at least twice now, Vancouver hosts a great riot after a hockey game. And there was huge failures, not just in the communication piece, not just in the fact that we weren't using common radio channels or able to communicate with each other, but we didn't have, you know, unified command. We didn't follow leadership, joint leadership decision making, and it was a huge failure on just how this entire situation was responded to. And I can definitely speak to it because I was there working that whole night. So out of that came a report, and ECOM was born. And ECOM is a great new system, and it was going to be great as far as fixing a lot of the communication problems, which it did. But from an interoperability perspective, it was still quite limited. It came with 4 talk groups, and that was it for all of the Lower Mainland. There was 4 talk groups. But with those talk groups, there was no governance. There was no training. There was no plan on how they were ever going to get used. It was sort of put out there. Maybe a couple of people had ideas, but definitely at the ground level, no one knew how to use this. I was actually sitting in a meeting in Richmond with my counterparts from the RCMP, the officer in charge of Richmond detachment. The fire chief was there. We were talking about communication strategies during big incidents. We'd gone into that post 9/11 CBRNE planning. We were worried about how we were going to communicate across large hot zones. I remember looking down saying, like, each one of us has the same portable radio. There must be a way for us to do this. And out of that, our combined events project was born. And we ended up getting 19 talk groups that were made available for that communication. But at the same time, everything was going forward on the East Coast as well. Nova Scotia identified that it was coming to the end of its system. It needed a new system. It had some amazing champions, and they've continued to really be at the, I would say, at the forefront of voice interoperability in Canada. They really decided to not just replace their system, but replace it with a proper system that worked for everybody. There were a number of people in this area that championed. Members of CTIG came together. We were having conversations about how is this going to look, because what a great opportunity to be able to have voice interoperability for all levels of government, as far as not just responders, but public works, different levels that are approved to be on the system, to be able to communicate. And they really did do a great job. And today, that idea and that system is spread to the 3 provinces. And I still think that this is the first in North America that I've been able to find. I welcome anybody to correct me, but this was the first in North America where we have 3 governments, 3 jurisdictions that are able to communicate with each other. They communicate independently on their assigned talk groups, but they do have talk groups where they can cross over, and it's fairly easy for them to adjust those radios. When we had the fires and we had to have support from New Brunswick, it was nothing for, you know, the Nova Scotia radio gurus to take those radios, program, do all the magic that they do on those radios, and make them work seamlessly with our system here. Same couldn't be said for firefighters from Quebec, because their radios weren't able to work in this area. So we have 3 provinces that are able to be completely interoperable. They're able to communicate with each other, and they do it very well.
Great job, Pascal, and thanks everybody for the invitation to participate today. Like Pascal, I'm very excited. This is something that for both Pascal and I'm sure for all the participants, the first responders that are speaking later, this is our lifeblood. This is something that we care very deeply about, and that comes from typically, in my case at least, from multiple failures where, you know, we didn't get the right information to the right people at the right time. And in a number of those cases, it was my fault. So it becomes quite personal. So jumping right in, post 9/11, chiefs of police, fire, paramedics, others across the country were kind of seeing what was happening in the States, and a report was commissioned. This is probably still available online somewhere. If not, I'm sure I have it somewhere. The Bay-Poirier report in 2003. I'm not going to read the bullets, but in a nutshell, they talked about kind of a lack of leadership, a lack of coordination, spectrum, a number of technical issues, but also policy and governance related issues that were critically missing in Canada. Next slide, Pascal. As a flow from that, the chiefs of police, I used to be on the Canadian Association Chiefs of Police Technology Committee, and we started talking about this at the same time, and we reached out to our friends from paramedics and fire across Canada. And long story short, CTIG was created to create the Canadian Interoperability Technology Interest Group. It was originally a part of the Government of Canada, a program of the Government of Canada, first at CPRC, the Canadian Police Research Centre, and then folded into the DRDC Centre for Security Sciences. But in 2014, we kind of went out on our own as a not-for-profit and kind of worked collaboratively to kind of have meetings, regional meetings and national meetings on a regular basis, where we will talk about these issues and drive many of these issues forward. These are just kind of some of the things that we did. Next slide, please. One of the main things, Steve Palmer, who was my boss at that time, he said, listen, we need to get everybody together. So we had our first national workshop. And as a result of that, everyone agreed we need a national level strategy. And so with some funding from the Government of Canada, we brought people together actually to the Shadow Laurier in Ottawa. And this photo was taken partway through the week. You can see Pascal up at the middle back. And these are experts from across the country, the police, fire, paramedics, government officials, Public Safety Canada officials, industry now, I said Industry Canada officials. And in 5 days, we built the first draft of what later became known as the Communications Interoperability Strategy for Canada. Next slide. And this was up until recently available online. If you're looking for a copy, I still have a copy. Probably still in the basement somewhere, have an actual paper copy. But this was the strategy that we developed. It was subsequently approved by every province and territory, by the ministers of public safety, or whatever the equivalent was in certain provinces. And it included, we were able to kind of get in right at the kind of the end, just before the deadline, the issue around broadband, which we'll talk about a little bit later, public alerting. One of the issues that wasn't identified initially, and we did try to get it added subsequently, but were unsuccessful, was the issue of Next Gen 911, which we'll talk about briefly in a second. Next slide. The key to this, and this has been now leveraged right around the world, and we borrowed it with pride, which is a term that we borrowed with pride from our British friends. We borrowed this model, this continuum, from our American SafeCom friends. And in a nutshell, if you haven't seen it before, what it says is if you want to be truly interoperable, you have to focus on 5 areas: governance, standard operating procedures, technology, training and exercises, and usage. Again, we don't have time to kind of go in depth to this, but in a nutshell, the idea behind this was that if you're going to be interoperable, like Pascal said, with the 3 province-wide radio system in down east, then you want to move to the far right of this continuum. If you're only ever going to work together once every 2 or 3 years, then just kind of get together and swap a radio, right? That works just fine if you don't do this on a regular basis. But to Pascal's point, technology, while critical, it isn't the only deciding factor. So you can have the best radio system in the world, but if you don't have the correct policies of when to turn it on and when to have common channels, and you exercise that and good solid governance, you will not be interoperable. Next slide. Action 700 was something that we launched. We were successful, we being the collective we, chiefs of police, fire, paramedics, a whole bunch of other folks, in getting 20 megahertz of broadband spectrum set aside for Canada, the same spectrum that FirstNet uses in the United States. We had tons of meetings with our good friends from the States, because of course we have a massively long border and we need to be interoperable across that border. There are firefighters down east that cross the border on a regular basis to help each other going either way. Paramedics cross the border on a daily basis. And so the ability to be interoperable and on both sides of the border was critical. Some good work has happened here, but frankly, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, nowhere near where we should have been. We were actually leading the way around the world on this, and then it all kind of came to to a very slow, I'm not going to say death because it isn't dead, but a very slow crawl. That we could kind of probably point fingers at a wide range of folks, myself included. But the good news is there are some pockets. For example, the Public Safety Broadband Network Innovation Alliance in Ontario is doing some great work, ongoing activity in British Columbia, and still discussions even down east on this. Next slide. With permission, I'm borrowing a slide. Full disclosure, I'm a part of the expert advisory board to this particular program down east, the New Brunswick 911 transition program. We just had a face-to-face meeting down in Fredericton last week. Not going to get into this slide, but in a nutshell, 911, it's just, and the next generation 911, it's just so critical when it comes to joint emergency response and the ability to get the right information to the right people at the right time. Pascal talked about the importance of privacy and the importance of security. But another strategy we helped build, what we did there was we talked about, traditionally it's been, well, you don't need to know that, Pascal. You don't work for the police, you work for the paramedics or the fire service chief. You don't need to know that. What we came to understand was that we need to flip the paradigm on its head and say, no, everybody needs to know everything, including the public, unless there's a true reason not to share that, which is often privacy-based or security-based. But that's a driver now that we need to get the right information to the right people at the right time. So, and if you want to know anything more about that particular program, we can certainly put you in touch with the great folks from New Brunswick. And there's people, agencies, organizations across Canada driving towards next gen 911. Next slide. These are just some of the numbers. You can kind of read them and you'll all get a copy of this recording. Hugely successful. Unfortunately, CTIG doesn't exist anymore. We can go into a sad story about how that all happened, but the reality is that we do have a gap now in who's out there, similar to what L'Abbé Poirier said in 2003. Who's out there kind of pounding the table and saying, we need to do better. And that's why I think both Pascal and I jumped at the opportunity to participate in this. Next slide.
Perfect. Thanks, Lance. And it's a good segue to what Lance is saying. And I will, just before I carry on, I see Fergus's comment about Newfoundland now being part of the Atlantic system, and that's my fault. I apologize. One, that was a slide I had from a while ago, but also I saw I didn't have that. I didn't have the information that they actually joined and finished up everything. So Fergus, thanks for pointing that out, which now makes it an Atlantic region program and not just the Maritime. So that's fantastic news. Hi, Craig. So what's next for us? And this is the part where I really want people, we've talked about where we were and how we started, but really what is next? And as much as we say it's not about the technology, there's still that huge importance that we have the right tools. The average first responder, the average emergency manager in this country locks up more advanced technology in their locker before they go out on shift. They lock up technology that sometimes they'll bring with them, on shift. And then we get into a whole world of problems. How many police officers, take photos of crime scenes or take evidential photos or make phone calls or text information on their personal devices? Same with paramedics, firefighters, taking photos, sharing it with physicians. This is what this looked like at the scene. Important information to share, but they're doing it in an inappropriate fashion. We're forcing them to do that. I'm sure there's enough law enforcement people on here that are cringing, especially some of the leaders, about knowing that their members are finding a way to do the job properly, but doing it the wrong way, either opening themselves up personally, opening up the force, or causing a potential evidential concern later on through the court process. So we need to find the way to get the proper tools to them to advance those processes that we've heard about. We've talked about voice. We've been talking about voice since 2000. We've been talking about data since late 2000s, and yet we still don't have that. We still don't have it to where it should be. And why is that? Why? I always hear lots of reasons. People saying why we can't do this. I've heard why we can't do interoperability for my entire career. I will put to you a challenge that if you can convince me why interoperability doesn't work, I will go public and I will admit that I've been wrong. I've seen it work and I've seen it fail. We've all seen it fail. And when it really comes down to it is, to this day, we still have silos. We either have organizational or professional silos, we have jurisdictional silos, we have personal silos, personal bias that are preventing us from making this work. A lot of the time it's down to some of the leadership, and I'll put leadership, I've put them out there before, that they need to explain why they're not taking this on, why they're not providing their members with the proper equipment and the processes to be able to do this legally, professionally, do it well and serve better, and ultimately make themselves safer. We saw this after 9/11, the post-action reports of why messages weren't shared with fire from police or what have you, and whatever side you want to believe, we lost lives because messages weren't passed on. And we've seen that repeated several times in major incidents. As I've said, when it works very well. When I heard the first firefighter and the first police officer talking to each other in Richmond, and they were able to communicate a safe, egress to an area, they were able to discuss proper access points, they were able to do things before they even arrived on scene. There was no more of this, a responder having to do the telephone game of tell their dispatcher passes it on to somebody else, who passes it on to the fire dispatcher, who eventually passes it on to the fire crew, and by that point it's too late. So we've seen it work. We've seen how this process works, how people can share information properly. There has to be those pieces with it, and we all agree to that, but it's not hard once you do it. And really getting those tools and those processes to our responders and the people in the field is what this is about. So how do we do that, right? How do we start to make that work? And we know that there's a number of steps to take. We've talked about governance. If you look at our, look at anything that we've put out before, we look at the governance is important. Governance has to be done first. Don't start with the technology, start with the governance. Get those SOPs, get those processes agreed to by everyone. Find the right technology. And that's key that I'm going to get into in a minute, but find that right technology. And then we have to build into that. If it's not done every day, you're good at what you do a lot of. And if you do a lot of nothing, that tends to be what you're good at. So if we're not training and exercising, because we do it every day, that's fine. But if we're not doing it regularly, we're not going to go back and use it when we're supposed to. If you think about law enforcement in particular, they train yearly on their force continuum options, how to be physical with people, how to train them, protect themselves and protect others. If there's a very low percentage of probability they're going to use those tools in their career. But they use a radio every day. They use a computer every day. And yet we limit our training on those. When we noticed that when we did the rollout for combined events, is that you were as good as your field trainer as to telling you how to use the radio. You used your ops channel, you used your TAC channel to talk about things sometimes, but that was it. Yet there was a whole lot of other capabilities with those devices. And really it's about that, keeping it going, making it practiced operability so that this is happening on a daily basis. I always caution people a little bit about the snake oil. I was having a conversation with one of the chiefs yesterday who's on our panel, and we both agreed and laughed that every time a chief goes to a conference, they come back with some great new sprocket that a vendor sold. Whether it's the right sprocket or not, doesn't matter. They now want this implemented. And we really have to be careful because we've all been through that timeshare piece, right? You go for the free cruise or the free dinner or whatever they're going to bring you for the free perk, but you have to listen to the timeshare blurb. I worked in a jurisdiction where there was a new radio system coming in. The jurisdiction was very excited about this. They were selling this to the organization. The organization was having to budget for it. They sold them the penthouse. It was a beautiful view. It was everything, all the bells and whistles, until we started to really work through getting it. And once we started to get closer to implementation, every time we'd ask a question, it was, oh, well, that's an additional cost. So be very careful that you'll always see the fancy thing. You'll always see the shiny bells and whistles, but you'll often get that, you'll buy that suite that maybe doesn't have the view that you were promised or have the support and the things inside that you were expecting. And I always caution people not to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of great work that's been done, not just by us, not just by some of the champions in Canada, but we look to the South, we look to our partners in the United States, and we look at the work that they've done. And as Lance said, we borrowed with pride a lot of what they had, and they were welcoming and giving it to us. They wanted to share that information with us, share what we could do. We fought very hard to get that spectrum and to get the spectrum that was aligned with theirs for a reason, because as Lance said, we do, a lot of work across borders, both ways across our borders. So we really needed to have that. So there's a lot of things that are out there. And I always say, people want that progress. Oh, we want progress. We want to do better. We want to do better, but nobody ever wants to change, which is always a bit of a concern for me. We know as we've said, the technology is there. You know, you go to a vendor, they will make you a portable radio or a laptop that can make you a great espresso coffee, do everything that you want it to do. We know that that's there. We have to improve the people. We have to take those people. Everybody that's here today, I hope you're getting a lot of some good learning. I hope we get some sharing in our question periods. But I hope you also don't just take today and listen to a bunch of presenters, watch a few slides, and then go off and go back into the norm. We need people to take this and continue to move it forward. We have leaders that have signed up for this. We have leaders that are speaking during this. I put to the leaders, it's your responsibility. It's incumbent on you to take this to that next level. And you never left a CTIG conference or workshop without tasks. That was one of the things I think we prided ourselves on, is that we always had those tasks. So I really hope that that happens today.
Thanks, Pascal. So not to throw the timeshares under the bus, actually we have some timeshares and we've used them around the world, but we also did that picture that you had with the garbage can. Yeah, we actually had that once. So but we've been pretty lucky. So to your point, interoperability, when it works, is just phenomenal, but it's not something that can happen on the spur of the moment. It's not something that, you know, when you have the worst day of your life and your community's having the worst day of your life, that is not the day to start to say, well, how are we going to do this? Right? That's why we do all this, like the 5 lanes of the continuum, and we run exercises and we have standard operating procedures, and you know, you run this exercise and it says that at a certain point, you know, the incident commander can turn on the interoperability channel. And then you know, halfway through the exercise, you realize, you know, it should have been the first officer on the scene that turned that on, who was actually the incident commander when they're the first officer on the scene until replaced. So yeah, that is just so critical. One of the things that we talked about a lot at CTIG events and conferences that we would all go to, at the, you know, fire chiefs, paramedic chiefs, chiefs of police, etc., was the issues around vision, leadership, and funding. And what I would say on a regular basis, and I'd say that's to everybody on this call, is, you know, when we built the national level strategy, our facilitator Chris Davis, he used a great model which we borrowed from the Americans. That kind of, one of the things that was on there is kind of, what's your vision? What does this look like in the future? Take away all the barriers, take away all the naysayers, what would that look like? Right. And I think, again, you know, New Brunswick is doing a good job. The now 4 provinces, fantastic to know, down east are doing a great job on the technical side. And I know that they've got policies and procedures in place. But what does that look like? One of the biggest challenges when you come to okay, well, what are the barriers to change? Number one barrier to change is always funding. We don't have any money. We don't have any money. Can't do it. Don't have any money. And my answer to that is, if there's 3 things that you need to drive change, in my opinion: vision, leadership, and funding. If I was told, okay, Lance, sorry, but you can only have 2 of the 3. You can't have all 3. You have to pick 2. 100% of the time, I will pick vision and leadership. Because with those 2 things, and I think, you know, we had that with CTIG, unfortunately it doesn't exist anymore, but with those 2 things and very little funding, we were able to drive some very significant change. You know, we're not taking credit for the 4 provinces down east having a phenomenal technology, but I can tell you, all the leaders that built that and drove that and did all the work, you know, the Terry Cannings of the world and Bruce Grandy's of the world and a whole bunch of other people from down east, they came to all the CTIGs and they talked and they said, what about this and how could we do that and what would that look like, and they met with the vendors there and they talked to vendors and what would that look like. And so give me vision, give me leadership. Funding, yes, it has to happen at some stage, but without the first 2, I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. Next slide. And finally, before we get into the discussion and questions and answers, you know, Pascal earlier in the presentation talked about, don't forget about the people, right? And he told the story about how this picture, phenomenal picture by the way, how this picture was taken. I come at it from the same way, and I know Pascal 100% supports this, but it's also an issue about mental health. It's an issue about our communities. It's an issue about how do we make sure that they're looked after? And the example that I give when we talk about that is there's a great video. If you have we didn't have time to show it today, but it comes out of the UK and it's called The Operator. And it's a 999 operator, fire service operator in the UK. And she takes this call, and as soon as the call starts, you can hear a woman screaming, and her child is there, and they're trapped in a fire. And I'll kind of condense this down. I was a dispatcher for a year, and I can tell you, even now, I'm having a physical reaction thinking about this. And anybody that's ever done that job, you're probably in the same boat. So I apologize if I'm causing some stress to you. And she takes that call, and it lasts for quite a while. And good news is that they're saved. And the operator just kind of, 999, may I help you? And she takes the next call. We have to remember that the people that are taking those calls are human beings. And as we move towards next gen 911, at some stage in the far distant future, there will be the opportunity for photos and videos and all that kind of stuff. But the question becomes, do we really want? I think we have to get. I know we have to get it from a policing perspective. At the very least, we have to get that stuff into the police service. But the question is, who's going to see it? Who's going to monitor it? Who's going to make sense out of all that massive amount of information? And what's that going to do to the individuals? All the first responders on this call, we've all been to horrific scenes. We could all tell you horror stories and just relive those, which is why most of us suffer from various issues. The 911 operators, they take these calls every day, all day. Imagine what that would do if they had to see these photos and videos every day, all day. It's just not possible. So we have to get that information at some stage. That will happen. It's not certainly part of the current phases of Next Gen 911 in Canada. But this is a discussion. Pascal and I talked about this at length before we did this talk today. Is let's remember the people, and that includes the members of the public who we are all here to serve. I think Pascal. Is that next slide, please? Yeah, there's our contact information, and then we'll turn it over to Maria to maybe Pascal. Any final comments, and we turn it over to Maria.
No. Let's just go right to Maria. I don't want to take away how you left us off. I think that's a very important thing for us to remember. So we'll turn it over to Maria for if there's any questions, and if not, we bought you some time. So.
Yeah, we're gonna open it up now. So please take some time to reflect on what they said here today. Put some questions in there for the Q&A. But I do have a couple here prepared, and the first one is kind of a rapid question. So I'm going to pose it to you first, Lance. And it's this idea: if you had to pick one thing, you had one major challenge to interoperability in Canada, what would that be?
Yeah, so I talked about vision, leadership, and funding, but and I think Pascal hit on it. Those silos, sometimes we call those silos of excellence, right? It's about culture. It's about, hey, I'm the police, I'm in charge. Well, actually, no, you're not. I was lucky enough to go to what used to be called the Emergency Preparedness College. It was up in Arnprior. It doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. A previous government canceled it, and it hasn't been brought back. I think it's one of the greatest failures from a Public Safety Canada perspective, not blaming any particular government, because two different governments have not resolved it. But when you went to that course, that was the first time I was a young sergeant. I'm okay, we're the police, we're in charge, right? And you go there and there's fire and paramedics and city works and a whole hospitals and schools and a whole bunch of people that are involved in these disasters. And you very quickly realize, oh my goodness, we can't do this without all of these groups, right? And so unfortunately, there is still in some places a culture that says, I'm in charge. I'm not going to share that. You don't need to know that. Well, why? Why don't I? And there are certainly times, in the policing world, there are times that no, it's top secret or whatever. But the vast majority of the time, what the hell? Like, let's get that information out there to the public as quickly as possible, and let's share that, right, with our partners. Pascal?
No, and I echo that. And one of the things that we really pushed for when we were doing the broadband proposal up and really having to fight off a lot of folks, that was talk about oceanfront real estate. That really was something we were fighting hard for to get. And we identified very early on that interoperability in Canada started with the blue light services. Is like, all right, your police, your fire, your paramedic services, and we need to get that right. That's a big piece of this. If they aren't working well together, if things aren't working well together, lives are impacted, and we need to make sure that they have everything that they need. But when we started to really look at it, what is interoperability, and especially with the broadband and moving forward, we knew we had to bring in other folks. And when I look at it from an emergency management perspective, the majority of major impacts to our communities, aren't the bad guy doing something. It's weather impacts, it's infrastructure failures, it's problems within our communities. That's public works. A lot of what we drive and thrive on is public works, is our different providers within communities. So if we're not including them, we're failing as far as interoperability goes. But we also need to have that bridge across when we talked about data sharing and that the broadband piece. Really, for me, what's important, we are blind going into a lot of our calls for service to this day. Police agencies, fire agencies have great, planning for various facilities, and they know access points and everything else, but you're not seeing what's happening. You're not getting that live data. And why are we not, at this point in time, able to have the police officer, as they're responding to an active shooter in a school, from their screen in their car, being able to see the CCTV camera, find out where the bad guys are, find out what's happening, tap into the dash cam of the snowplow to be able to get information from the hazardous materials, for the hazardous materials team. We have 8-year-olds that are walking around in our communities with devices that allow them to stream, to send stuff every day. They're at scenes before the responders are, broadcasting this information that our responders don't get to see until they arrive. So I really think, for me, the importance of that inclusion of interoperability, bringing in healthcare, bringing in our different levels, and finding where that all fits and how it works well together is what's really important.
Absolutely. What's something that you would want to share with our audience, or to challenge our audience with, if there's some homework that you could give them today, essentially, if you will, marching orders? What's something you'd want to share with them? Lance, I'll start with you again.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously we can't give anybody any orders, but the challenge, that's especially me, I'm retired, right? And I can't do any of that. The challenge is, to Pascal's point, we always try to do this at CTIG events. And if you've ever been to one, and many of the people that I'm seeing some of these messages, and many of the people have been to them, is a book that I've loved for a very long time. It's very old. It's called Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive. And in that book, he talks about, I'm not going to give you the whole story, but he kind of talks about the importance of, doing one thing that you can do to make a difference. If you're working at Costco, that one thing is, you maybe see something hasn't been sold for a long time. So you go to your manager and say, hey, can we move this up to an end cap, or can we try to get rid of this old stock? That one decision might make 0.00001% on the profit margin, but it's a good decision because it's something that person can do. So what one thing can you do? Like, if you're in a community, the first thing you've done is you've joined this call. Well, good for you. Have you ever seen the interoperability continuum? Do you do exercises? Have you done a personal assessment or community assessment on where you are on the interoperability continuum? Pascal and I would both, and I don't know about Pascal, but neither of us are looking for work. He's already got a job. I don't want a job. But an informal chat to say, how would you do that? Happy to help with that, right? Happy to help with that. So that's my challenge, is kind of what one thing can you do that nobody else can do to improve communications interoperability, public safety interoperability, emergency management interoperability in your community, in your province, in your town, with your organization. Pascal?
I think that's key. And I do want to point out, I noticed that somebody, David commented that our Canadian Forces folks weren't mentioned, and they were, and I apologize, they weren't mentioned in the presentation. A lot of focus. I mean, we tend to focus on what we know, which is police, fire, paramedics, because that's what we do. But really, forces were involved. They were at CTIG. They were very much involved with that. We do have challenges in Canada with accessing our Canadian Forces personnel. That's gotten better over the last few years, but there's still that barrier, and having that interoperable piece is key to a lot of the responses. But there's still challenges with making that jump. A lot of our barriers, quite frankly, federally, it's hard to access that. whether it be training, whether it be standards that people have commented on. You know, how do we get that federal layer in? Interoperability is still left to the jurisdictions to deal with. It's at the local level, it's at the provincial level, and that's pretty much where it stops. I would really like to challenge the leaders in this country. You know, we don't have CTIG, as Lance mentioned. Sadly, we don't have that national voice, you know, for that. We have our chiefs associations, and I would really push that any of our leaders on this call go to your chiefs association. Police chiefs are still very active when it comes to finding better ways of doing things, and they have a lot of their working groups. But our fire leaders, our paramedic leaders, I would really challenge to push the chiefs associations. I know there's a lot of priorities. I know there can only really be one priority, but I know there's a lot of things that people want for their professions to be able to serve people better. But this really has to change. And unless the leaders of our various organizations, and you know, we have a national association for emergency managers. I would challenge anybody who's on here from those organizations to really look at how do we start to have this. You have your time on the Hill. You have your time with your leaders in the country to be able to share that information. We have designated ministers responsible for those areas. I would really challenge the takeaway today is to go, why isn't this working? Do what changes you can locally. And I think that's key. But where are we? Where are we nationally? Why can we still not, you know, move a police officer seamlessly from Nova Scotia to Alberta to help out? Why can a firefighter not be picked up? And I mean, we can from a technical perspective. I know that we can do that, move the person and some of their equipment, but we don't. We have a loss when they get there. Why do we not have? We're fairly linear, you know, in our country as far as being able to get our resources back and forth. Why do we not have that? Why do we not? I think Alex mentioned, why do we not have those standards? I just saw recently, I think it was Alex, a couple of others that just went and did some COML training in Maine. Right? They had to go to the States to get this COML training. I was fortunate with a couple of others in BC. We went and did one of the first COML training in the way to go to Washington State, do the COML training back in whenever that was, a long time ago. But the Americans have done this and they've pushed this forward. They offer us the training. We see this with emergency management. There is no national standard. We don't have an ability to be able to give the training. The college in Ottawa is closed. Iron Prior is closed, right? Like we don't have those capabilities. So I would really, my challenge is for the leaders here to take it back to your associations, take it back to your local leadership or your local government leaders, and just push that. Why isn't this happening? I'll get off my soapbox now in case we have something else. So.
Maria, I can just jump in on the one for Damien. And I don't, can everyone see these questions publicly?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So if you look at the comments from Damien, who I know personally, Damien's a leader in this field. He actually worked in Comm Center, and so totally agree, Damien, that you know, closing that loop. In fact, that was a big discussion that we had last week in New Brunswick, closing that loop with call takers and dispatchers to make sure that they're, you know, if they want, that they can be kept up to date. It is very important on the emotional side. So thank you for that, Damien.
Right, that does take us to the end of this session, but thank you both so much, Lance, Pascal. This has been really great hearing about that history, hearing about what we can do moving forward. So really appreciate your time with us, and I'll hand things back over to Maria.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.